You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 192 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we are discussing a body part, specifically the tongue.
We are returning to just a whole episode about a specific part of the body.
Yes.
And what a fun part of the body to do an episode about.
It's a cool appendage. It gets so weird, so fast, and this has been one of my favorite of the body part episodes to do, so I'm very excited to get into it. In this, we'll talk about what makes up a tongue, what it is, how it varies, and how we're able to study this soft body part in the fossil record and what we're able to glean from the evidence we do have.
Yes, as you might imagine, for an organ in the eating place. Mm-hmm. Very informative about lifestyles and habits of modern and fossil animals.
Yep, both for mundane stuff to weird stuff.
It's much like teeth.
Yes.
Episode 88, we had a whole discussion about teeth. Teeth are extremely valuable to study because they are one of the fundamental interfaces between a living organism and its environment.
Absolutely. So we'll be discussing that this episode. The reason we'll be discussing that this episode is because it was requested. All of our episode topics are requested, sent in by you lovely listeners. This topic was requested by Nora, Stephanie, Lydia, Milu, Amanda, Linda, Curious310, and Frederick.
Thanks, everybody, for the suggestion.
Absolutely. It was a wonderful excuse to get to dive into all sorts of weird tongue fun facts. Now, before we get into our sections of the episode...
Into the meat.
We have some announcements. First announcement, as always, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon funds the podcast top to bottom. It allows us to do all the amazing things we get to do and allows us to make these episodes for you all to enjoy. And when you sign up for our Patreon, you also get some extra goodies, extra content, extra contact with us.
Live streams. Gifts and presents.
And one of the benefits you can get at certain levels is shout-outs here at the beginning of the episode. So we would like to welcome some of our newest patrons, Travis, Emily, and Nifty Naru.
Welcome, and thank you for your support to our new patrons and all of our old patrons and our future patrons.
Yes, thank you.
Could be you.
If you're interested in signing up or checking that out, the links are down in the description. You can also find other ways to get in contact with us and interact with us and our community. You can also find our mailing address, and we got some mail recently.
We did.
We got some gifts from the Royal Tyrrell Museum when AJ visited it. We got some keychains with our names on them. We got a bumper sticker that says Dino Export on board, which I like.
It's true. Where's the line?
And then we got a nice patch.
Thanks so much, AJ. This is super cool. Museum swag is awesome.
I'm gonna add the keychain to my keys because this one's adorable.
I actually also was gifted a bunch of keychain stuff from the London Natural History Museum. So at this rate, I'll be able to just make a massive set of keychain stuff from different museums.
Well, and I'm a sucker for these rubbery ones. I don't know. I think it's just the tactileness of them, but I love these textured rubbery keychain things. They make me I like when magnets do it. Excellent choice. In other news, we have some extra stuff coming up. Spotlight 2024 is still coming out.
Episodes every month.
We have them coming out every month at the first Wednesday, so the next episode will be at the beginning of June.
It's going to be a good one.
It'll be a good one. And also in June, it's June.
It's June. That's Croc Month.
That makes it Croc Month, which means Snake and Croc Month is around the corner.
The time of year has come. It is the summer. Every year on the Common Descent Podcast, we celebrate June as Croc Month and July as Snake Month, and we do this with a bunch of silly, fun, extra stuff. We will have some themed episodes related to crocs and snakes. Stay tuned for that. Our Discord Q&As and patron live streams, we will be ready to talk about crocs and snakes on our Discord. The Croc Chat channel will be open just for June, and then the Snake Stuff channel will be open just for July. This year, for a special extra new thing, we are also doing Croc and Snake Month live streams.
I'm very excited.
Because we're on a live stream kick. We love doing the live interactions with our guests. We will be having a Croc Month live stream on World Croc Day, that is June 17th, and then we will be having a Snake Month live stream on World Snake Day, which is July 16th. Follow the links in the episode description. Go to our website. You will find the links to those live streams and join us, and we'll just chat all about crocs and snakes and all sorts of cool stuff.
It's going to be a ton of fun. It's always been a lot of fun, so I'm very excited.
Most importantly, Croc and Snake Month means the return of the Crocs and Snakes Patreon tier. This tier is available to join only during June and July, and patrons who subscribe at this tier get the usual benefits. They get Croc and Snake Month stickers, and the support we receive from these tiers on our Patreon during these months contributes to charitable donations we will be making later in the summer towards conservation efforts for our favorite reptiles. This year, we will be making donations once again to the Crocodilian Research Coalition and Save the Snakes, which we have donated to in the past. And this year, we will also be adding a third charitable foundation because, as much as we love crocs and snakes, there are other animals that deserve attention, so we will also be sharing a portion of that donation with the Turtle Survival Alliance. Share some love with some other of our reptilian friends out in the world.
Also cool, not as cool, but very cool still.
Still pretty runner-up. That's the
so close.
Bronze medal.
You're
Way
right
to go,
there.
turtles. We love turtles. Turtles are great, and they deserve conservation as well. The summer is a fantastic time to join us on Patreon because you can support us as well as supporting these donations we're making to conservation efforts. And this year, 2024, is even better because a fan of the podcast, who is a business owner, has agreed to match donations that we will be making up to the first $1,000.
Yep.
Which is fantastic. Here's what that's about. This business is Mayflower Enterprises, which is a small engineering firm in northern Indiana, here to help you discover your potential, whether you're a newly founded startup, have been in business for 20 years, or just have an idea on a bar napkin. Mayflower stands ready to bring their Fortune 100 experience from automotive, aerospace, and manufacturing and construction to help your organization discover its potential through process development, personnel training, future-proofing, and more. We have, they say, a passion for the environment, scientific discovery, and deeply nerdy hobbies that includes listening to the incredible team at Common Descent Podcast. Hey, that's us.
Yay!
We are so thrilled to partner with them this year to help support Croc and Snake Month by matching funds for the specialty tiers up to the first $1,000. That is fantastic.
That's amazing.
We are so excited to be part of that because that money's going to conservation efforts, and you, dear listeners, get to be a part of that and contribute to that for us. So check out the links in the episode description. Go to our website and find the live streams. Find our Patreon. Support us and our reptile friends if you can.
It's going to be great Croc and Snake Month this year. I'm can't wait. And with that, we will wrap up these very exciting announcements and move into our first section of the episode, the news. Every episode, we like to gather up some recent paleontology, evolutionary, earth science news that helps us all stay up to date with what's happening in the scientific world. David, what's the news?
This episode is all about tongues, which is a weird topic, so I'm starting with a very normal topic. This news is about dinosaurs.
Hey, they have tongues.
Specifically, they do have tongues. Specifically, dinosaur thermoregulation, the way that they manage their body temperature through time.
Ooh.
This is research by Alfio Alessandro Chiarenza et al. In the journal Current Biology, and in the blog post, we will link to a press release in Sci News for your reading pleasure. Dinosaur physiology and thermoregulation are much discussed topics. The question of how dinosaurs manage their body temperatures, we talked about it a bunch in episode 179 on thermoregulation. Birds, modern dinosaurs, are endothermic. They are, quote, warm-blooded. And there has been tons of evidence to suggest that some other dinosaurs might have been some version of endothermic or something similar. This isn't just a birds thing. This happened at some points around the dinosaur family tree.
Yes.
But exactly the details of that, when and how and why it happened, are not agreed upon at the moment. This research is a big putting a bunch of data in a pile kind of research, combining evidence from dinosaur biogeography, where they live in the world, their evolutionary history, their relationships and major evolutionary events, and climate models through time to try to find trends in where dinosaurs were living over time. And trends they find. They note that early dinosaurs are mainly known from warm and dry climate regions. So low latitudes, near the tropics, places like that, which is not surprising. That's where reptiles tend to be largely restricted to.
Yes, yes.
We see that today in reptiles, especially bigger reptiles, and just generally through time, reptiles tend to follow warm and dry regions.
Yeah.
They note that looking at dinosaur evolution over time, theropods, that is the group of your two-legged, mostly meat-eaters, T-Rex, Velociraptor, all them, and ornithischians, which is most of your big herbivorous groups, the horned dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, and so on, both of those groups expand into cooler climate zones starting in the early Jurassic.
Ah.
This roughly coincides with a warming period called the Jenkins event, just a warm snap, basically. It's also a time where we see radiations of new major groups of both ornithischians and theropods, including, for example, coelurosaurs, which would go on to be the most diverse group of theropods.
Yes.
They note that this expansion into cooler regions might be an indication that they had developed adaptations for surviving in cooler spaces. And that endothermy, or something like endothermy, may have gotten started as early as the early Jurassic in these groups. They also make the point that ornithischians and theropods are both groups where we have found feathers or filament-like structures, which have been suggested to possibly be a correlation with warm-bloodedness, because those are helpful insulation. They also noted a similar diversification and shift in hadrosaurs during the Cretaceous thermal maximum, another warming event that shifted where in the world hadrosaurs tend to be found.
Mm-hmm.
So they're finding evidence that for these groups of dinosaurs, climatic shifts were important in sort of rearranging dinosaurs and in the radiation of certain groups, and possibly adaptations for surviving in different areas and different region conditions.
Interesting.
Meanwhile, the third group of dinosaurs, the sauropod lineage, your big long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs, did not do this. Sauropods seem to stay in warmer, drier regions pretty much throughout the whole Mesozoic. They don't expand into cooler regions, higher latitudes, and stuff like that. They tend to thrive in warmer, drier regions, so sauropods may have been restricted by temperature. This is something we've mentioned before in other newses and other research that has been found in other studies, that sauropods seem to have been restricted to lower latitudes. So they might not have had certain adaptations that would allow them to survive in cool climates, or they may have had they may have had limitations.
Yes.
Even if they had some adaptations that they could have gone up there, they may have been lacking something else, or they may have needed something that those other groups didn't need.
Yeah, the environments might not have been as productive, or having as much of the food they needed or something.
Yeah, so it seems theropods and ornithischians were, starting way back in the Jurassic, able to start expanding into different climate zones. Sauropods never quite managed that.
Well, and it's really interesting to me that it seems like periods of warming were potentially the triggers to allow them to break into those adaptations in new areas, versus a period of cooling where it seems like that could very logically be the pressure to make life adapt to cooler environments. But instead, it's warmer temperatures allowed them to move into new areas and move out a little bit of their ideal areas potentially.
Yeah, that maybe they were able to invade new spaces and then adapt to living in those places even after that warm period had ceased.
Maybe it lowered the barrier for being able to shift into these cooler habitats and develop these adaptations that would help them.
Yeah.
That's not a pattern I would have considered before they found this.
Yeah, so this is a broad scale picture that thermophysiology seems to have followed different patterns in different groups
Yes.
at different times. And so further digging into this kind of evidence can help us interpret when those things happen. And if indeed theropods were getting started on warm-bloodedness by the early Jurassic, that means that the basis for bird physiology like we know it may have started almost 200 million years ago.
Yeah.
All the way back then.
Very cool. Well, my first bit of news also has to do with major shifts of our planet and how it may have affected life. This just goes way, way further back to the Ediacaran. This is research looking at how shifts and changes in the Earth's magnetic field might have affected the evolution of life at that time. This is research by Wentao Huang et al. In Communications, Earth and Science. And the article is by Stephanie Pappas in Live Science. So the Earth's magnetic field is, we currently have a magnetic field, and the Earth has had a magnetic field, but it has fluctuated and shifted and changed as the Earth has changed. This is the field that helps protect us from solar radiation and cosmic rays. It's generated by the movement of our Earth's core. As the Earth's core shifts and moves around other portions of the inside of Earth, it creates a magnetic signal, basically. It's the same concept as if you run electricity through a wire, you can create a magnet. If you spin a bunch of molten metal, you can create a giant kind of electromagnet. The Earth's core has not always behaved the way it does now. In early Earth, the core was transitioning. It was shifting and eventually would start to behave like it does now, but it didn't at first. From the evidence, it seems like early on, the core would have been fully liquid and not as solid as it is today, and would have still caused an electromagnetic field, but it would have been churning differently. So just different parts of our mantle and core interacting in different ways, still affecting a field, still protecting Earth, but not the same way and probably not the same intensity and exactly the same, maybe not the same exact signal. Over time, it cooled and the core solidified, began spinning and behaving the way we know it now, and started producing the field that we've had basically since then. But that transition period likely meant that the field fluctuated heavily and potentially weakened as it slowed from one way of working to a new way of working. This research looked at crystals from rocks in South Africa and Brazil that date back from 2 billion years ago and 500, almost 600 million years ago. These were pyroxenites and gabbros. These crystals preserved signals from the Earth's magnetic field in the way they solidified and cooled, and are able to give an idea of what the magnetic field was like. Not super early in Earth's history, but quite a bit earlier than we usually discuss.
Yes.
And at a time that overlaps with the Ediacaran. 2 billion years ago, the magnetic field seems to be about as strong as it is today. So fairly comparable. This would have been when it was in that liquid state. The core wasn't the same as it is today.
Cool.
At that roughly 591 million years ago, it seemed to be about 30 times weaker than it is today. From what they found, the weakest value yet known for time average values. And it seemed that there was about 26 million years of this weakened signal. So the field seems to have weakened significantly during this time. It was also suggested that it could have gotten close to or even periodically disappeared altogether. That we might have lost a magnetic field for a period there before the core began to become more solid and spin the way we now know it, interacting with the other layers of the core. This overlaps with the Ediacaran. We've talked about the Ediacaran before. This was
episode 31 was all about the Ediacaran.
Indeed, this period ranges from 635 million to 541 million years ago, and is a period where we start to see larger life form fossils. Not yet the bony mineralized fossils that will become famous in the Cambrian explosion, but it does seem to be when life first started to get big and complex, at least in a way that fossilized, and is a notable event that's kind of a precursor explosion of light to the Cambrian. The fact that these overlap raises the question of, could there be something that syncs up with the fact that we see this sudden rise in complexity with a major shift in the electromagnetic field? And they suggest there could be a way that these connect. The way the electromagnetic field works is that it's basically a force field around Earth, but it comes out of the poles. So at the poles, it's running more vertically. And if it were to weaken, it could basically form a gap at that area, which could allow some of our atmosphere out and allow us to lose that protection in those spots. The thing they suggest that could cause is a loss of hydrogen. That hydrogen molecules could be lost more easily with that loss of full protection. If we lose hydrogen, there's less for oxygen to bind to, which could free up oxygen.
Yeah.
And could have raised the usable oxygen in our atmosphere just by not giving it anything to bond to and making it a new source that life could have been using to evolve and metabolate with. So they've put forth the suggestion that that could be why we see these sync up with an explosion of more complex evolution happening at a time when our atmosphere might have been shifting due to the extremely weak magnetic field we had at the time.
Yeah. It's interesting. Talking about the magnetic field and its relationship to life is always interesting because it's very tempting to suggest that if the magnetic field changes in some way, it will affect life. But typically that seems not to be the case.
Yes.
Right? The magnetic field flips and switches and changes through time, and there doesn't really seem to be a consistent link between those changes and anything with living organisms. So the idea that if there was an extreme shift in the magnetic field, might that have been enough to actually make some notable changes in the atmosphere that might be linked to changes in the nature of life on Earth? I'd be really curious to see if this kind of data for the magnetic field, could we get that sort of information from across Earth history? Would it turn out that this has actually happened a bunch of different times?
Yes.
And we happen to have found the one that is happening along with the Ediacaran biota? Or is this a unique thing that happened at that time?
Yes. Is this a one-off, or have there been other extreme dips?
Yeah.
They also noted that this could be very informative for how we interpret the histories and potential evolutions on other planets, is by looking at what their magnetic fields do and getting some outside information that way, because other planets also have magnetic fields and also can do weird things.
Yeah. Anytime we get to talk about the magnetic field is really fun and interesting, because people like to ask about what happens if we lose our magnetic field, and what does the magnetic field do for us, and what changes in the magnetic field, what would that have done to our atmosphere and life? And so often it feels like the answer is because we don't have a ton of information about that kind of Earth mechanic, and we don't have a ton of information about how magnetic fields interact with atmospheres on other planets. And we obviously don't have any other examples of magnetic fields interacting with life on a planet. And so there's always that irritating feeling when we talk about this that's like, but are we weird?
Yeah.
Is Earth weird? Can we get... that's why I brought up, I'd love to see, can we get that magnetic information across Earth history to see what patterns we can see?
Absolutely.
Very cool. Well, speaking of other planets and atmospheric conditions,
cool,
I've brought along a news about Mars.
Yay.
We are traveling all the way out into space to talk about ancient conditions on Mars. This is research in JGR Planets, published by PJ Gazda et al., and we will link in the blog post to an article in Live Science by Sharmila Kathuner. There are lots of paleontologists on Earth. There are very few paleontologists on Mars, but there are not zero paleontologists on Mars. They're just made out of machine parts. The Curiosity rover has spent the last decade plus, I think it went up there in 2012, exploring a place on Mars called Gale Crater. Within Gale Crater, there is a geologic formation called the Murray Formation that consists of fine-grained lacustrine sediments, which means a lake.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the sediments we find laid down in a lake or similar environment, which, right off the bat, very cool. Waterborne sediments. The Curiosity rover, among its many things that it does, is looking for signals in the chemistry and mineralogy of Mars to interpret the past history of the planet. Curiosity is not looking for direct signs of life. It's not really equipped to do that. So calling it a paleontologist, I guess, is a little bit of a stretch. But it is characterizing the geological conditions to understand the ancient history of the planet. Part of the way that it does this is it collects some sediments and then blasts them with a laser to vaporize them and then analyzes the cloud to determine what is the composition of those rocks.
Curiosity is so delightfully sci-fi. I love it.
Fantastic. This study notes that the Curiosity rover in these examinations found in a particular area unusually high amounts of manganese oxide. Oohs and ahs from the crowd. You all know what's coming, manganese oxide. Notably, the space where these rocks have been analyzed is an area where the sediments of the Gale crater are more coarse, bigger sediments than usual, which suggests a shoreline area, possibly a place where a river was flowing into the lake and carrying bigger chunks of sediment in. We see that on Earth today. Once again, awesome river. So cool.
Right? Yes.
That's Mars is a place where we go, a river, how exciting.
Ah, it used to be wet here.
But the manganese oxide specifically is exciting because it indicates two things that are commonly linked to living conditions on Earth. One, manganese is used for a lot of metabolic reactions on Earth, but also the presence of manganese oxide, the authors note, might indicate high oxygen levels in the area. And of course, high oxygen is exciting because life as we know it on Earth today thrives on oxygen. The authors discuss a variety of different ways that manganese oxide might have been being formed. On Earth, manganese oxide can be produced by microbes, but we do not have any evidence so far for microbes on Mars, and that's not the only way it can form. Groundwater passing through sediments in various conditions can precipitate manganese oxide, or it can be precipitating out of the lake water into those sediments. They discuss a variety of these different paths, but note that all of those paths require an abundance of oxygen.
Yes.
So they purport that the presence of this high, and they noted it was something like 45 times higher abundance of manganese in these, something very like this is a big spike in this mineral. So high oxygen, abundant manganese are exciting because of their potential links to life. That is by no means direct evidence of life, but it is potentially evidence that some of the things that life needs on Earth might have been present in this area on Mars in the past. Now, it is important to note, and this is mentioned in the Live Science article, which is why you go to journalistic articles to get this broader context, there has been other recent research that has addressed this kind of interpretation that has found evidence to suggest that manganese oxide doesn't necessarily require oxygen to form, that the presence of certain other elements can lead to the formation of this compound, elements like chlorine and bromine. So it's possible that this isn't a high oxygen environment. Although I wonder if you could then analyze those sediments to see, do we see those other signs of those other elements around? So there are alternative explanations, alternative pathways for how this could get in there. But the authors of this new paper, at least, suggest the likelihood that this could reflect high oxygen abundance.
Very cool. Anytime we get more information about what the conditions on Mars might have been like, it's exciting because, we're learning about another planet to a degree that we've not gotten to do with any other planet because we've not gotten to go onto any other planet.
Yes, we're learning about another planet to a degree that we weren't able to learn about Earth like a century ago.
Yes, so it's like that's we have all but boots on the ground.
Yes, we got wheels on the ground.
We got wheels on the ground, and so it's always exciting, but it's also delightful from just a analytical aspect of like every discovery we make is just full of so many questions of like, does this mean there could have been life? If there wasn't life, why wasn't there life? If there was the stuff that life might have needed,
Yes.
if it did have the stuff they could have used, why didn't it evolve there? Why did it happen here, not there? And so it's just this list of questions come up every time Curiosity makes a discovery, and it's very exciting from just a scientific perspective.
Now, another thing that I think is important to note, and the outside authors do make this, they're quoted as making this point in the article, that oxygen also isn't required for life.
Yes.
Like, there's plenty of life on Earth that gets by without oxygen. The formation of life on Earth happened without high oxygen levels like we have today. So those aren't the only conditions we need for life to start, but it's always nice to find evidence of particular chemical compositions or atmospheric conditions, because that can tell us about conditions that we might expect to see certain types of life forms and what to look for in the future with even more paleontologically inclined robots on Mars in the future.
Well, it kind of feels like when a doctor's trying to diagnose a disease of like, start with what you know best first. Like, check those off the list. And then if none of those are lining up, then we can start getting into weirder life situations that could make sense or are very rare here, but start with the ones you know best, and then we'll work our way through to all the other options. So cool.
Yeah. Mars seems like a pretty cool place.
It's neat.
I'd love to go there someday. That's honestly not true.
I
don't want to go to Mars.
I do, but I know it's not.
I'm not equipped.
You know,
I'm not equipped to handle Mars.
No, but man, that's such a fun idea.
Put me in a jar. And
yes.
then way in the future, we'll go to the amusement park.
Yeah, and then aim me at Mars. My next bit of news does not have anything to do with alien life, but almost, because these creatures are about as close as we get here. This is about starfish, and those are pretty alien.
Very little in the way of tongues in the news in the tongues episode.
We're doing, just like language, we're doing a terrible job.
I meant to start by saying I've got news about a place with no tongues whatsoever, and is the planet of Mars. These newses have nothing to do with our main topic today.
Nope.
No segue.
This is research on a starfish fossil that seems to be in the process of splitting.
Ooh.
This is research by Ben Toohey et al. In the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, Biological Sciences. The article is by Aaron Hunter in The Conversation. Sea stars, starfish, are echinoderms. They're extremely populous today. They're super cool, super weird, and one of the things they can do is reproduce by splitting. They have an amazing ability to heal and regrow body parts. You know, famously, if you cut a limb off of a sea star, they will grow it back. But if you cut a sea star in half, they can just grow 2 new sea stars from those 2 halves. There are some, though, that use that as a form of reproduction. This is often called fissiparity or fragmentation. This is well known in different sea stars, but is especially known in brittle stars, which are ones that have the wiggly arms instead of the more stiff-armed with relying just on the tube feet. They can use their arms to move around more. The brittle stars best known for this, the fissiparous brittle stars, are also known for having 6 arms instead of the famous 5.
That's wrong.
Yeah, and having more than 5 arms is something a bunch of sea star groups do.
Yeah.
There's ones that go up to like 11, like the Crown of Thorns sea star has a whole bunch.
I don't love a sea star that has a number of arms that isn't divisible by 5.
Right?
You're supposed to be pentameral.
No, this one's a hexapod. They often have 6 arms and are often epibionts, meaning they live on host animals. This could be like, I saw pictures of them on the shells of oysters and stuff.
Yeah.
And like, I think it's often other sessile, stationary
They're not
organisms.
like barnacles riding around on whales.
No.
They're typically hanging out on top of another thing on the seafloor.
And it doesn't sound like they're parasitic, but just that they tend to live on other life forms, and that they form these kind of clonal fragmentation communities that just spread kind of like coral and other things, but it's a bunch of individual brittle stars instead of a connected colony. This is a known aspect, but the fossil record and the evolution record of it is not well known. This fossil potentially is giving us some direct insight into this. This seems to be a 6-armed brittle star, articulated still, so in one good piece. It's from sediment from the late Jurassic of Germany, dating back to 155 million years ago. One half of the body seems to be in the process of regeneration, with 3 normal arms on one side and 3 smaller arms on the other.
Huh.
So it seems to be in the process of healing. That's not really up for debate, it seems. Like,
sure,
it is
you've got
regrowing.
Little, like Deadpool style.
Yes.
You've got some limbs that are tiny and on their way to growing back.
The features of this specimen have led them to identifying a new species.
Cool.
Named Ophiactus hex.
Characterized by having 3 tiny arms and 3 regular-sized arms.
Makes me think of Jonah Hex. The
I was also going to say,
right?
It does sound like a comic book name.
He's got a big 6-shooter and a little 6-shooter.
A big 3-shooter and a little 3-shooter.
The fact that this has 6 arms could be that it regrew too many arms. That does happen sometimes.
That this is supposed to have 5 arms,
yes.
And you made a mistake.
That does happen with sea stars. They don't always regrow to a perfect shape. They sometimes have anomalies happen. This could just be due to the way the injury happened or some genetic anomaly that comes in and causes them to regrow differently. But looking at other brittle stars that appear to have been undergoing regeneration and other fossil specimens, seems like this is a 6-armed brittle star that's regrowing, and it had originally 6 arms. Which means that there's a higher chance this could be a fragmentating brittle star, a member of the group that reproduces by splitting. So if they split in half, they then have to regrow that half that they split from.
Yeah, well, especially if it sounds like half of the arms are in the process of regrowing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas typically you'd expect an injured sea star to be missing maybe 1 arm.
Yes.
Maybe a couple. It's not impossible that something happened and you're missing 3 arms.
Yes, you definitely could have gotten broken or bitten in half somehow.
But it also is consistent with splitting down the middle and having to regrow the other half.
Phylogenetic studies put them in the same group as many other fragmenting Fissiparus brittle stars.
Cool.
So they seem to be in the right group for the behavior. This will also make them the oldest member of that family. So if this is indeed evidence of this form of asexual reproduction, it means it goes back to the Jurassic in this group at least, and is a very rare occurrence of us finding direct fossil evidence for a form of reproduction in a group of animals.
Yeah, fossil discoveries like this are a lot of fun because you don't need the science-y implications to understand why it's cool. Like, this is cool by itself.
Oh, yes.
Every now and then we'll find a fossil like this where it's like, these are 2 turtles in the fossil record mating, in position mating. Or here's a dinosaur fossilized sitting on its nest of eggs. And it feels like that scientific paper could have just said, it's 2 turtles mating, publish. Like, that's so cool. That is just such an exciting thing to see.
Yes.
But those discoveries are always really informative about the lifestyle and evolution of ancient life. They are typically one of the only examples of that kind of thing.
Yep.
They're rare and that kind of stuff doesn't fossilize well. And because of that, they always tell us something we didn't know before.
Yeah, if we're getting to see it for the first time, who knows what that might inform?
Yes. So there's always this layer of like, here's this, we found this fossil animal inside this other fossil animal and it got eaten. That's awesome. You don't need to say more than that. But there is more than that, and it's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't know before.
Yes.
This has that same sort of... we found a fossil starfish in the process of regrowing half its body.
Awesome.
That's so cool.
Like, that's one of the coolest things sea stars do today.
Absolutely. I did say starfish, and I would like to apologize.
I flip back and forth.
To all of our marine biologists and fish. And sea stars, for that matter. I'm so sorry that I called you fish. That was very rude of me. But then there's so much cool stuff to learn about. Yeah, this tells us about the anatomy of these ancient stars, possibly their reproductive habits, and the evolution of this ability and this group.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It's tons of fun. Awesome newses. We've talked about a bunch of cool things, none of which had anything to do with tongues. But
no, I mean, the dinosaurs have tongues.
They do have tongues.
And That's it.
Yep.
That's as close as that got.
But we were talking about them, and talking involves tongues.
We had tongues the whole time.
They were here throughout all of it. There you go. That's a segue for you.
Great.
This episode topic, we'll be discussing tongues, and we will start that discussion after the break, so stick around. Tongue should be a topic pretty familiar to most of us.
I've got one.
I've got one.
I'm using it right now.
Yep. The tongue is a very unique part of the body because it's doing a bunch of jobs. And it does even more as we look at the variety of them across the animal kingdom.
Yeah, a very versatile bit of tissue.
Extremely. Even in just us, it does multiple jobs.
Wears many hats, so to speak.
Little tongue hats. But before we go into all of that, let's talk about what the tongue is. The tongue is a muscle. It's actually many muscles. Mm-hmm. It is a muscular mass, and I saw it called a voluntary muscle. It's not reflexive. It is something we control. It does things not always with your thinking about. There's a bunch of things that it does.
Sure, like when you swallow, it's got sort of automated motions to go through.
But we have control. I can stick my tongue and go, bleh, and move it on command.
A 3-leaf clover out of it.
Yep, I can roll mine.
Dear listeners, if you didn't roll your tongue or make a 3-leaf clover out of it when we said that, are you really engaging in the podcast experience?
This is an immersive experience.
Those of you who did, way to go. You're on the same bit. Bonus points to you.
So the tongue is a muscular structure. In us and mammal tongues, there's no skeletal structure in the tongue, but there is skeletal structure associated with the tongue, the hyoid, which is a set of bones, and depending on which group you're looking at, depends on how many bones. But on us, it's a little horseshoe bit of bone in our throat, where a lot of the musculature and like connective tissue attaches for the tongue.
Yeah, the tongue, it's kind of like an elephant's trunk.
Yes.
It is a mobile, dexterous bit of tissue that is pretty much all muscle.
I saw it described as hydraulic movements in the fact that the movements of muscle in the tongue one direction cause movements in the other. So like if you flatten the tongue out, it widens and gets shorter top to bottom.
Yeah.
And then if you thicken the tongue up, it gets skinnier side to side. That it's always the same volume of tongue. It just changes shape depending on, so one set of movements affects other dimensions of the tongue.
Yeah.
All known tetrapods have tongues.
Amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals,
yes.
tetrapods.
Most amphibians have tongues. There are some that don't have them as adults. They don't have them as larvae, which we will talk about more.
Huh.
Fish don't have true tongues, but they do have a tonguey structure.
Yeah.
They have a raised portion of the floor of the mouth, and it is the same position and material-ish. Like it's likely the same place that the tongue came from, but it doesn't have muscles, so it's not movable. It can be used in swallowing in some mouth functions. For the most part, they don't really have a tongue.
Yeah, sort of a proto-tongue.
Yeah.
Or a para-tongue, I guess.
Yes.
Near tongue.
A tongue pad, but not doing any of the other tongue stuff. There are some that have tongue-like structures. Lamprey famously have their barbed tongue that they use to drill into the victim that they will be feeding off of. But that's a different structure that is convergent to tetrapod tongues. Amphibians have tongues, but larval amphibians, tadpoles, do not. They have the same little bumpy pad on the bottom of their mouth. They gain a mobile muscular tongue in metamorphosis.
Huh.
Yes. Some don't. There are some. The Pipidae, African clawed frog, toad, and the Suriname toad do not have functional tongues.
Interesting.
And they are aquatic amphibians that feed like fish.
Yeah. So as our larval amphibians typically are feeding like fish.
So you don't need a tongue to swallow in water. Tongues are very helpful for swallowing on land.
Yes, this is one of the biggest benefits of if you've ever tried, dear listeners, to chew and process and swallow your food while keeping your tongue extremely still, it is very hard to do.
Yes, and arguably you can't swallow without your
I don't
tongue.
think you can swallow without...
If you're going to swallow, you're using some of your tongue and hyoid muscles.
Yes.
That's how we swallow.
Whereas fish are often sucking up food into the mouth directly.
Well, and they have water to help them in the swallowing.
Yep.
They don't have to get rid of the water to swallow. So they can use that medium to help them. We can't use air to help us swallow. It's not a thick enough medium to help the food flow down our throat. There are other things that have structures similar to tongues. Inverts have a lot of things. Proboscis in bees and butterflies are often compared to tongues.
Sure, because they're kind of a long structure that is a feeding structure.
Yep, and in the bee, it comes out of the mouth, like it comes out of their face. But those are actually paired mouthpart structures that are used for sucking. So those are like a straw that comes out of their face, not actually a licking structure, so to speak.
Yes.
The closest one that's a licking structure is the radula in mollusks.
Yep.
Snails are famous for these. This is a chitinous ribbon with tooth-like structures on it. And they can use this ribbon of chitin to rasp these teeth along or against something. And it's used. That's how they eat plants. They scrape away the plant with this very rough tongue, quote unquote.
Algae. Some of them will use it as a drill to drill into shells, and this is a structure in the mouth.
Yes.
So it is very tongue-like.
Yes. This is a structure unique to mollusks, and it's found in basically all mollusks except bivalves have some form of the radula. At least it's found in every group. But it is once again not actually a tongue, and not even made out of the same kind of tongue stuff. It's just in the same part of the body, helping with feeding. So
yeah, this is similar to our discussion about tails.
Yeah.
In episode 151, a lot of invertebrates have a thing that is like a tail.
Yep.
But by vertebrate standards, technically not a tail.
Or like the horns of a rhinoceros beetle are not actually horns.
Right.
That's extensions of the outside of your body.
But it is fascinating that multiple different widely spaced groups of life have evolved very similar tongue-like structures.
Absolutely.
I want to say like cone snails, their like harpoon thing is that the radula?
I think that's the radula.
I think it's the radula. If not exactly the radula, it is another tongue-like structure that is being used to acquire food.
Yep. But for this episode, we will basically be focusing on vertebrate tongues and specifically tetrapod tongues, since fish don't, for the most part, have tonguey things.
A rare case of an episode where we won't talk very much about fish.
Yes.
Join us next time for talk about fish.
Surely.
I know what the next episode topic is, and that is a false promise.
What? Surely fish will have their day. So let's talk a little bit about what makes up a tongue. It is a muscular structure. It is made out of 8 muscles.
Is that true across all tetrapods?
This is
or like
in
humans?
us, in most mammals, I think.
Okay.
Not all tetrapods share all of these, but in our tongue, and I believe this is shared across at least a lot of mammals, there are 8 muscles, 4 intrinsic and 4 extrinsic. The intrinsic muscles change the shape of the tongue, make it wide, make it skinny and stick out, or round it when you're using it for different motions and speech. This is very important for changing the shape of the tongue. They run along different portions of the tongue to do different jobs. The extrinsic muscles control the positioning of the tongue, moving it left and right, forward and back, up and down.
Right. WASD.
Yes. So these muscles together can let you reshape your tongue and move it around in your mouth or out of the mouth. That's also something that's kind of unique about the tongue, is it's an internal structure that often we use externally.
Yeah.
To lick something, you have to stick your tongue out.
Extrude from the body cavity, which normally you do not want your organs and tissues extruding from body cavities.
Basically, all other internal organs are meant to stay internal all the time.
Yes.
Part of the support structure for these muscles is the hyoid bone. The hyoid in us is much reduced. It's just that little horseshoe of bone. It is a free-floating bone, a sesamoid by definition, that it is not attached to any other part of the skeleton other than by connective tissues, but it's not associated with the rest of our skeleton, really.
Right. It's not, if you put a whole skeleton together, there's no place to slot the hyoid
You would have to hold that up by like wires or something.
Yeah, to get it in correct anatomical position.
It's found roughly about halfway down your throat between the mandible and our shoulder blades. It is different than other sesamoids. Most sesamoids are developed from connective tissues. This one does form from cartilaginous tissue, like other bones. So it's formed the same way as skeletal bones, but it's hanging in the body the way like our kneecap is, where it's free floating. In most animals, it is composed of generally 10 bones, bony elements and 2 cartilage elements. 4 are paired, and then there is a unpaired section in the middle that is the basihyal. That is actually a fusion of 2 parts.
Yeah.
This
so
is
it's kind of like the sternum,
Yes.
where there's a bunch of stuff down the middle, and then there's pieces that are paired off the sides.
Absolutely. This is kind of the default mammal situation.
Sure.
Groups have modified it extensively. We'll talk about that later in the episode. But it kind of typically looks like a bar down the middle with 2 branches coming off of the side, and then in lots of groups, another set of branches, so that these 2 prongs, many groups have gotten rid of one of the prongs, so now it kind of looks Y-shaped, or like a slingshot. Once again, that is a very, very generic description of a body part that is so ridiculously diverse and specializable.
Yeah.
This, though, is really important because it supports the tongue, but it also does other jobs. It can help support the larynx. It can help support muscles in the throat for swallowing. So it's important for just a lot of the jobs going on in the mouth and throat.
Yeah, a lot of the muscular and soft tissue stuff that needs a place to anchor up there. It's not anchoring to your neck vertebrae.
Yes.
You know, that hyoid is providing a really important structural point.
So for swallowing, chewing, speaking, it's very important for us. In a lot of groups, it's important for breathing. It has association with breathing muscles. This is common in amphibians and reptiles. Ours is notably unique because it is fully separated from the tongue, like location-wise. There's still connection to it, but it is no longer in the same place as the tongue. With many other animals, the hyoid is basically part of the tongue.
Right, it's like the base of the tongue.
Yes. And so ours is weird. And we will talk about this in more detail as we go through the episode, but our hyoid and tongue are weird and distinctly separated because of the way our neck and head have resituated. One of the things that is notable for that with us is our tongue has moved back, and part of our tongue is in our throat.
Yes.
Like the back of your tongue is the beginning of your throat, basically. That's not the case for basically all other animals. Most animals, the tongue is just a mouth structure. It doesn't have anything to do with the throat. The tongue doesn't have a part in swallowing like ours does the same way. The hyoid still does, but the tongue is in the mouth.
Yeah.
So we have a very weirdly placed tongue and hyoid for mammals, but animals in general. So there's a lot of things that you can compare, but we are very unique in the positioning.
We're a bad example. To make the comparison again, episode 151 was about tails. We are a bad example of an animal. We are not the typical mammal condition when it comes to tails.
Precisely. The same goes for the waggly bed at the other end. Our tongue is also weird.
Tongue, also weird.
One of the big things that means is that we can't breathe while we swallow.
Yeah, that's true. I sure can't.
Other mammals can. Babies can, because their tongue hasn't moved all the way back yet. So they can breathe while they're suckling, but then as they mature and their tongue takes the adult position, they lose that ability. This is called the palato-epiglottal lockup that allows the ability to swallow and breathe at the same time.
Huh.
We don't have that. Us adult humans don't have that. Which is pretty much the only mammal that I found mentioned that doesn't have that.
Yeah, once again, we are weird. We're an
weird.
odd case here. Some of our listeners may be able to think of some of the functions of our tongue and hyoid apparatus that may be one of the reasons why we're such a weird species among mammals.
Yep. One of the other jobs that tongues do is taste. That's probably the most famous thing that tongues do.
Yes, I would say so.
Taste. We have taste buds on our tongues. These are structures that have taste receptors, and these are the things that actually detect the different kinds of chemical signals that relate to different forms of taste.
Right. Much like in our eyes, we have light recepting cells that can tell different types of light, and in your nose, you have receptors that can tell different cues that you're smelling. Taste buds work basically the same way.
Yes.
Little lock and key mechanism that tells the cell what signal to send to the brain.
We have different taste receptors for different tastes. There's taste receptors for sweet, bitter, sour, salty, and umami, which is the savory, meaty flavor, which evidently I found one paper saying is one of the most studied because it's weird compared to the others. It's a less easy to place flavor. So there's a bunch of study trying to understand what actually umami is.
Yeah.
One common misconception is that these receptors are on sections of the tongue.
Yeah, you'll often see like a diagram that shows bitters over here, sours over here, sweets over here, and it kind of goes around the tongue.
This is not accurate. All the taste receptors are found all over the tongue. There are certain areas of the tongue that are more sensitive and more, densely packed, maybe of a particular kind, but you can't not taste a taste on a portion of your tongue.
It's not like the right side of your tongue can't taste sour.
Yes. There might be sections that are better at tasting a certain thing, but they all of your tongue can taste all the flavors. So it is not actually segregated out the way that diagram kind of shows it as.
Yeah. I assumed that was just a convenient way to demonstrate what the different tastes are that the tongue can taste.
Yeah.
And then it became popular and people started taking it literally by accident.
Yes. I saw that noted multiple times of things like, hey, just to make a point, no.
Yes,
no
it's a common diagrammatic way to demonstrate that. I feel like I had the Magic School. I want to say the Magic School Bus computer games had that same
right. Yeah.
thing when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very commonly repeated image.
I remember having a book that talked about it, and then I would try to do it.
Same
couldn't
thing.
Quite get it to work the way they were implying it should work.
Because it doesn't work that way.
It turns out. Now, this is not the case for all animals. Lots of animals have taste buds in around the mouth.
Yes.
Reptiles are famous for having them in the gums.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically snakes, whose tongue has lost most of its function for tasting and eating, they can only taste something when they bite it.
Yeah, this is something that is in a lot of animals, and reptiles, I think, specifically, only part of the tongue has taste receptors because the tongue has become sort of segmented into different functional spaces. And then in some cases like that, the taste recepting is actually done with other tissues.
Yeah. And so like there's lots of lizards who have taste buds on the tongue, but they also have it in the gums. And then others where it's the gums are doing more of the work than the tongue for tasting. Birds and mammals, it's mainly just on our tongue that we have taste buds. So some groups, they've position the taste buds in different areas in different groups. You'll also notice a similar difference with saliva glands. We don't have many saliva glands on our tongue. The mouth is doing most of the saliva production, but there are animals that the tongue is producing saliva just like the rest of the mouth.
Yeah, the tongue sweats.
Yes. So it's where the different jobs of the mouth are happening kind of just shift depending on which group you're looking at. There's not a consistent where they are always located, but for most of them, taste buds are on the tongue and not as many saliva glands on the tongue. One of the things that you might not know about tongues, because it's just not, we often think of it as a soft body part, it is keratinized. Mm-hmm. The top of our tongue has a lot of structures that are keratinized, like fingernails and hair, to be rough and tougher.
Yeah, and you can feel it on your tongue. There's that kind of weird, rough, tonguey texture.
Yeah, if you rub it against your front teeth, you can feel that there's a little bit of kind of a sandpaperness to it. These are called filiform papillae, which are kind of little hair-like structures on the top of the tongue, and they arch backward. They have a structure so that they bend backward easily, but they can't bend forward very easily. And it's to help keep things on the tongue and in the mouth. Mm-hmm. And to move things backward toward the throat.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why stuff stays on your tongue as well as it does.
Well, that's why we can like lick ice cream and stuff and actually get a good bit of ice cream with our tongue. Mm-hmm. Our tongue has a grippy surface to the top of it. It's very subtle. You know, when you touch it with your finger, it doesn't feel like sandpaper, but it is there. This is a hugely specialized and divergent aspect of the tongue in a lot of groups. It's fairly consistent across most mammals. Most mammals have a fairly similar, textured and keratinized tongue. But there are, of course, ones that are specialized. Cats' tongues are a specialized form of these papillae, these hair-like structures that for them have become specially shaped and particularly tough, so that they can actually comb their hair and lick meat off of a kill. So theirs is now actually acting as a tool outside of just food retention.
Yeah, it's a scraper.
It's a scraper. Across other groups, some of them show a trend in habitat, in how keratinized their tongue is. Amphibians tend to not have very keratinized tongues, and this is partially because they are wet mostly. They are living in wet habitats, and their body is wet, so the tongue stays as damp as their body and the habitat is. But in animals that are living in drier habitats, we tend to see more keratinization to handle the fact that it's more likely to dry out as I'm talking or I'm eating. Mm-hmm. I'm exposing it to drier air now that I'm not living in the water. And that keratin protects the tongue's surface. It can also be protection from abrasion if you're eating something that needs a tougher structure and would damage the tongue if it were softer. that keratinization can be increased.
Yeah, I believe in a lot of lizards, like the upper part of the tongue, the farther out part of the tongue is keratinized and it's softer farther back.
Yes, absolutely. But they also show a notable degree across the tongue of keratinization top surface. But the front is more keratinized for a lot of them. Turtles are probably the best example of the environmental one. Freshwater turtles, many of them have unkeratinized tongues. Terrestrial turtles and tortoises have heavily keratinized tongues.
Cool.
You'll also see it, though, with diets. Rodents were noted to have very keratinized tongues, potentially just because they eat tough food.
Yeah.
And they're needing to have a tongue that can handle that. Because one of the jobs of our tongue is also to, like, crush food up against the palate of our mouths. There's a reason
our tongues aren't great at. Although some soft things you can do it with.
But there's a reason the roof of your mouth is ridged. That is a structure for us to be able to push stuff up against it, and the surface of our tongue is tougher to be able to handle that job. There are definitely some that don't follow the habitat thing. Crocodiles have extremely keratinized tongues, and they spend time in water. Marine mammals vary. Carnivorous, predatory ones like seals and sea lions and sea otters have very keratinized tongues, indistinguishable from land predators, while cetaceans have very smooth tongues, and so do manatees.
Oh yeah, I guess that I've seen like whale tongues, and they're pretty soft looking tongues.
So it's not one-to-one with habitat. The fact that mammals are super keratinized might just mean that our ancestor was very keratinized, so we came with a very rough tongue. Birds have extremely keratinized tongues. This is sometimes called the tongue nail, because it is a very tough tongue for many species. One of the most famous examples for the papillae being extreme is penguins, which have these large spike-like structures on their tongue that face backwards, also inside their mouth. So that when they catch a fish, this slippery fish can only go one direction, and that's down the throat. Birds also, this is just a side note while we're talking about bird tongues, they also have a trend in reducing the tongue. Lots of birds have a smaller tongue than you might expect. Toucans, they know to have a very small, slender tongue, no longer used in food manipulation. When they grab food, they have to chuck it back down the throat with a knock of the head. Yeah. It's called ballistic food transport.
Yes. Or it's a inertial feeding.
Yep.
I think also applies to this. Gravity's doing it.
Yes, absolutely. That's how crocs feed, because their tongue is fused at the bottom of their mouth. They can't move it. But birds evidently show a trend in reducing the tongue.
Interesting.
Not all of them, but a bunch of birds show it. So, this leads nicely into us talking about the jobs the tongue has. The tongue has many jobs. Some that are fairly standard across a lot of groups, and then some that are very specialized to certain groups and certain individual species. One of the most obvious is food manipulation. It's in the mouth where we are putting food, and with us it helps us in chewing.
It helps move the food into the space between the teeth, because we can't move our teeth very much.
Exactly.
So we have to move the food into them.
And so this is how you get food to the right part of your mouth where you want to chew, how you move it from the teeth to the back of the throat where you're going to swallow it.
Also very useful if you have to spit something out.
Yep.
The tongue is very important for that.
Absolutely. So it's a very important job in moving things around the mouth and just kind of managing that space. A lot of the muscles also important for swallowing, just that actual act. So not only getting it into the right place to swallow, but then to swallow it. There are some animals that literally chew with their tongue, so to speak. There are bony-tongued fish that are in the group Osteoglossomorph, which includes things like moon eyes, knifefish, the arowanas, and elephant fish. They have a special structure that is a tongue-like structure in their mouth. They are noted for having 3 sets of jaws. The mandibular jaw, the normal mouth jaw. The pharyngeal jaws, which are the famous fish secondary jaws that like moray eels have, that are part of the arches that support the gills. They also have a tongue bite apparatus, which is the technical term for it.
A tongue bite?
A tongue bite apparatus that is a bony part of the basihyal that has teeth-like structures, and I think there's also corresponding teeth on the roof of the mouth, that they can use to kind of shred and chew their food once they have it in the mouth. And it's like there's a mixture of ways they can do it. Yeah. Of either like grinding it or like holding it with their mandibular jaws, and then that will kind of shred it up. But they have a chewing structure that is part of the hyoid, assembly of bones.
Right, their version of a tongue.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Right?
Also creepy and weird.
Super weird. While we're on the note of food, there are plenty of animals that feed with their tongue, where that is the tool they use to get the food into the mouth.
Yes.
Many of those that is kind of passive in that they are like lapping up stuff.
Right. Well, like when a dog or a cat drinks water, they're licking the water up. Or if anybody has ever had like a pet lizard, like a bearded lizards will do this, where they don't grab a cricket or something by biting it. The tongue kind of comes out and sticks to it and pulls it into the mouth.
The example I always use for that is if you've ever eaten popcorn as a kid by sticking your tongue to a kernel and pulling it in.
Yeah.
You're eating with your tongue. This is common for nectar drinkers.
Oh, sure.
But all your nectivorous birds, like honey eaters and hummingbirds and stuff like that, often have long tongues. These are different shapes of tongue that pick up the nectar in different ways, but they lick it down into a flower, into the nectar well, and then pull up the nectar with the tongue.
Yeah.
Hummingbirds are famous because their tongue actually splays out into a two-pronged structure that doesn't pull the nectar up like by capillary action, which is how they thought it worked, as like basically a straw, but actually grabs the nectar with its structure. Not muscular, the physical structure of the tongue does it, because it works on dead hummingbirds too.
Huh.
It's just the shape of the tongue, when dipped into liquid, grabs up a bunch of liquid, and then can be brought back into the mouth.
Wow.
Right? One of the most famous extreme of these tongues that I found was a leaf-nosed bat. Leaf-nosed bats are nectivorous bats. They drink out of flowers. They have long tongues. One in particular that I found, which was a fairly recently discovered species, is in the genus Anora, and it was the species name Anora fistulata. This was found in Ecuador. It was found with other leaf-nosed bats in the same genus. The other two species, they measured the tongues to try to compare. The other two had maximum lengths, depths of the tongue coming out of 36 millimeters and 39 millimeters.
All right.
These are bats, so they're not big.
Sure, a few centimeters of tongue, which was impressive.
This new one had 84 millimeters.
Huh.
150% of its body length.
Yeah.
This is a ridiculous tongue. This is longer compared to body size of any other mammal, including things like the pangolin.
Oh, wow.
This is the longest tongue to body size of any mammal and is only beaten out by the chameleon.
Wow.
It's ridiculous.
Cool. For nectar.
For nectar.
For scooping up nectar.
For scooping up nectar. This tongue is so long it comes back and attaches to the rib cage, the base of
So,
the tongue.
Instead of being anchored in the throat,
Yep.
that hyoid like ours is, it's anchored all the way down on the ribs.
This is found in others. The pangolin is famous for attaching to the last pair of ribs near their pelvis. They are famous for the one of the longest tongues that you'll come across. They have a 66 centimeter tongue at the upper ranges.
So a 2-foot long tongue.
2-foot long tongue for an animal that is not too much more than 2 foot.
No, pangolins are like bobcat size.
Yeah.
They're not super big.
Theirs is divided into 3 parts: the anterior oral section, the middle thoracic section, and the posterior abdominal section.
You have an abdominal section of your tongue. This is the part of the tongue that hangs out next to my stomach.
Yep. There are tons of extreme feeding tongues. Chameleons are one of the most famous, probably.
Sure, they have a ballistic tongue.
A ballistic tongue that launches out of the mouth to catch insects. They're not the only one with tongues like this. There are salamanders, lungless salamanders also, who have ballistic tongues.
Sure.
Quick note on those two. Their tongues work differently.
Yeah, they do.
And it's so cool. Chameleon tongues are positioned on the hyoid. Their hyoid has a prong in the front, a horn. Or spike that sticks off the front of the hyoid, and when they're ready to launch their tongue, it goes into position in the mouth. It moves up the throat into the mouth, and that horn is sticking out of the mouth with the tongue ready on it. The tongue has rings of muscles that then squeeze that spike, and because it's tapered, it slides the tongue off very quickly.
And launches it.
And launches it forward. And then the tongue is carried by its own momentum to the prey, with the hyoid staying in the mouth. The salamanders launch the hyoid.
So before we were talking about how it's weird that this is a tissue that goes outside of the body. bones are definitely not supposed to go outside the body.
Yeah. So their hyoid, remember how I said some animals have like a Y-shaped hyoid?
Mm-hmm.
They've still got that front part, but their back part is just these two slender spikes. So that sits in the tongue. There's two sets of muscles on either of the back spikes, and they do the same thing. They squeeze the bone, it slides the bone forward and out of the mouth with the tongue to go catch the prey. So they launch the hyoid with the tongue.
That's so cool.
And it's one of the fastest movements in the animal kingdom. The most extreme of these can have very long tongues. One of them, the alpine hydromates, they said had a tongue that can shoot up 80% of its body length and goes out and back in what is measured in milliseconds.
Wow.
So it's one of the fastest vertebrate movements, period. And they have extremely long tongues that are launched in a very unique way.
Yeah.
That's evolved from what they can tell 2 different times in the group.
That's so cool.
Ridiculous.
Amphibians seem to have a trend for sticking their bones outside of their bodies.
Right?
This is not the first time on the podcast that we've talked about amphibians that stick their bones out.
What are you doing? Those belong in. Those are indoor pets.
Those are inside tissues. Episode 163, Claws.
Yep.
To hear us talk about Wolverine frogs.
Oh, and then you can look forward to whenever we do a ribs episode.
Because there's some of that too.
Ugh. There's also other birds that do it for prey capture. Woodpeckers use theirs for gathering up insects. They also have extremely long tongues with extremely weird hyoids. They also have Y-shaped hyoids with the 2 hyoidal horns, as they're often called, the back portions. Many different groups within the wrynecks and other woodpeckers, it wraps around the back of the skull, so up behind and back over the skull. Some are so long that they enter the nasal cavity.
So you mean back, around, and over the skull, and then into the nose.
And then into the nose. And it's different for different ones. The 2 horns enter the right nasal cavity in the green woodpecker. The horns of the wryneck terminate in the left nasal cavity. And horns of the orange-backed woodpecker attach near the base of the bill.
Weird.
It's super weird.
That's so cool.
And
so woodpeckers have a tongue that wraps around their skull.
Around their skull instead of going like down into the ribcage for other long tongues we've talked about.
Yes.
So there's different ways to store a very long tongue. And then they have a spiky tongue that's used to like pull insects out of holes and like hook them and pull them into the mouth.
Yeah, I know that like anteaters who are also using their tongues in a similar way to scoop up ants, in them, if I remember correctly, it's mucus covered.
Yeah, it's very sticky saliva.
And that's what's capturing them. I think pangolins, it's the same thing.
Yes, I believe so. And hedgehogs also have long tongues that are doing the same kind of job. So like lots of different ways to have prey capture tongues.
And then just a quick reminder that earlier on the note of things that are not tongues but kind of like tongues, cone snails.
Cone snails.
Cone snails who have a tongue-like structure that acts as a harpoon gun.
There's also like worm and leech-eating snails that use their radula as a hook. Like, have you ever seen the video of the snail eating the worm and it just inhales it?
Yeah.
That's using the radula as a hook system.
Like you're pulling someone off stage.
Yes.
That worm you've been pulled off stage forever.
Yeah, but that long hook that comes out is someone's tongue. That's like a Magnus episode. 2 interesting uses of the tongue for prey capture are baleen whales, specifically the rorqual whales like the blue whale and the fin whale. They have that pleated throat, those expandable throats that let them take in a bunch of water.
Yeah, it looks like the tube of a tube sock.
Yes.
With those long ridges running along
Exactly. And like that, it allows it to expand and flex outward.
Yeah. Also not dissimilar to the structure of scales on egg-eating snakes.
Yes, precisely.
That can really expand the throat.
One of the things that happens when they open their mouth to engulf a bunch of water and hopefully a bunch of fish or krill is the tongue inverts into the throat region, like into the body to make more space, and that's part of the suction.
Yeah, creating negative space.
Yeah. Once, in this case, like turning a sock inside out, the tongue goes in, and then is part of the piston that pushes the water out when they expel the water to keep the food.
Wow.
Right?
There's a lot of things you can do with a important structure that is mostly just soft tissue and muscle and stuff.
Yeah. It's very flexible. Another similar feeding style to this that's not using the tongue but the hyoid is the mata turtle. Mata turtles are a aquatic turtle.
If you don't know what a mata is off the top of your head, Google mata
right now.
You're welcome.
One of my favorites.
They're
they're
these
so
just
good.
flat, spiky turtles. They're so cool.
They are as close to a pile of leaves as you can get while still being a turtle.
Yes.
They feed with suction feeding. So much like a lot of fish feed, as you mentioned earlier, they open their mouth and their throat, create a vacuum that pulls water in to fill that vacuum because nature abhors a vacuum. And that hopefully pulls in with it the prey. Their hyoid is what's letting them open their throat.
Oh, yeah.
Their hyoid is super, super specialized to create that open space that creates the vacuum. It's this big structure. We had a cast of it with our skull, and it's massive with the two big horns coming up to open up their throat when they inhale a prey item.
Cool. For clarity, you had a cast of one, I assume, at the aquarium.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Not just one that we had.
Yeah, no, I used to have it.
Our mata.
Got lost in the move.
Tama left his hyoid behind for us.
I promised I'd mail it to him, and then I forgot.
Now that's just my hyoid.
That's just my hyoid.
It's just been here for so long.
It's,
now it's really awkward to bring it up.
It's part of my habits. It's part of my daily habits. I can't not have it.
Right.
Whew. Speaking of turtles and weird stuff with the tongues, alligator snapping turtles.
Yeah.
They have a specialized tongue for catching prey, but not for actually grabbing the prey like all the previous ones.
The prey is doing the actual work.
Yep. They have a lure tongue.
Yes.
They have a vermiform is often the word you'll see for worm-shaped tongue that they can wriggle. And there's like a bunch of specialized muscles and stuff going on there for them to be able to make it dance. Mm-hmm. And they open their mouth, wriggle the tongue, which is pale white against a murky brown black mouth.
Yes.
Lure a fish in and grab it. They're not the only ones to tongue lure. There are snakes that tongue lure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so cool. I didn't know this. This was something I discovered while looking at these notes.
We've talked before about snakes that tail lure.
Yep.
The spider-tailed viper very famously.
Yep. There's a bunch of pale-tailed snakes that do the same sort of thing.
Yep.
That's very common. The African puff adder is known to do both tail luring and tongue luring, flicking the tongue to try to attract prey. And the coastal house snake, which is from South America, is known to use this for fish. So very similar to the alligator
snapping turtles are also fish hunters.
Yep. So there's not a bunch. It sounded like when the coastal snake was discovered in that paper, it was only the 6th species yet known.
Yeah, I have to imagine that it's a lot of an easier, more efficient strategy in water.
Yes.
Than in air, because in water a thing can just swim right over to it.
Yeah.
And it's a little harder. The mechanics of that don't quite work as well. And so aquatic tetrapods are really the only ones who maybe can use this very effectively.
Yeah. But yeah, tongue luring is a thing.
I mean, that's way more efficient than tail luring. Is you're pulling them right into the space where they need to be. You barely need to move.
Now, if you tail lure by accident, you have to turn all the way around to get to your tail.
Yeah. The snapping turtle only has to move one bone in the whole body.
If you yawn...
Just the jaw, just...
Yeah, if you yawn and catch something while you're yawning, convenient. It's just convenient.
I've yawned and caught stuff while I'm yawning, and it's not at all convenient.
No, it was very unpleasant. If it were a hot dog, I'd be happier. While we're on snakes, another thing that's interesting for the tongue is sensing. Now, we talked about taste, which is commonly thought of, but there are others that sense with their tongues. The flicking of the tongue of a snake is used for picking up chemicals. It's smell, kind of.
Yeah.
To then bring to the vomeronasal organ, the Jacobson's organ, and deposit it in the mouth to detect chemicals from the environment.
Yeah, in our body, our nose can pick up scent molecules of a certain size, and then our tongue generally is good at picking up bigger molecules.
Which are called tastants.
Yes, which is why you have to physically put something on the tongue, but the nose can pick up little molecules that are just floating in the air. Snakes and lizards that also do the tongue flicking thing are scooping up, physically scooping stuff out of the air and then depositing it on the vomeronasal organ. So it allows, as far as I understand, it allows them to pick up a wider range of types and sizes of molecules.
Yeah. And then they have the specialized tongues that get forked that can help them follow the trail more efficiently.
Yeah, because just like your nostrils, right? You can tell if a smell is coming from your right because your right nostril's picking it up stronger or first. The forked tongue of a snake or a monitor lizard or whatnot functions the same way.
Absolutely. So tons of jobs the tongue can do, and probably one of the weirdest is the one we're doing now. Is talking.
Did a whole episode about that last episode, actually.
Yep. For us humans, the tongue is indispensable in speech. This is one of the most, like, along with the muscles of our larynx and lips, is one of the most important things that we have for speaking.
Yes. After the language episode, there was a conversation that spawned on our Discord with a bunch of people geeking out about the International Phonetic Alphabet and the ways that we categorize sounds. Dear listeners, if you've never seen one of these, look up charts of how different phonemes, language sounds, are formed in the mouth. Different language sounds are formed with differing positions of the teeth, the lips, and the tongue.
Yes. Now, this is something fairly unique to us humans. Our tongue is very specialized for this. It's very rounded, so it can make shapes a lot of other tongues can't make.
That three-leaf clover again.
The position of our hyoid is partially helpful for supporting parts of the larynx, so like it's directly connected with our voice box. But because our hyoid and tongue are positioned differently, they function differently when we make noise. Most other animals, their tongue is only in the mouth and isn't associated with the larynx the same way. Most others, their tongue is not utilized as heavily in vocalization. That's mostly happening in the throat. It's not utilizing the tongue.
Yeah, I think we're not the only animals that use the tongue to make noises. There are birds that do noises with their tongues.
And there's definitely animals that will, like, the tongue helps modify, where they stick the tongue out while they're making a noise. But it's not the main organ
it's
being
not
used.
Shaping the air quite nearly as meticulously as ours does.
It's a lot less important for vocalization in most other animals. We're really the only one where it is key to the sounds we make, which is weird.
Yeah, once again, another way that our tongue is unusual.
It's like with languages, where language is the way humans communicate. Our tongue is part of human language. It's inherent to us. It's not how most other animals talk to each other.
And indeed, language is sometimes called tongues.
Yes.
Your native tongue.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that's like an intentional link to the anatomy of it, but it does feel like it is at some level a recognition of how important the tongue is to speech in humans.
Very satisfying label, because yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because it's true. Yes,
it's true.
Absolutely.
It's accurate.
The way you're using your tongue is different.
Yep. There are so many other examples we could go through with the things tongues do, and versions of tongues and types of tongues, and specific. I didn't even mention giraffe tongues during all this.
I was going to say giraffes come to mind.
But this had to be a whirlwind, because there are distinct tongues in every group of animals you look at, and even within a group that has unusual tongues, there are often unusual members within that group. So if we did not mention your favorite tongue, I apologize, but go on to our Discord and say what your favorite...
Go share your favorite tongue.
Yes.
I'll share one other weird example. We talked about how it's weird that our tongue is an organ that goes outside of the mouth. Special shout out to dogs, who are maybe the only animal whose tongue goes inside other animals' mouths.
Yes, yep.
I've met lots of dogs that seem to think that their tongue is in the wrong mouth.
Yep. Well, and that's another example. They use that to heat control. They bask...
Panting.
The evaporation of the saliva off the tongue helps them cool down.
Also, we mentioned cats using their tongues to groom. We did not mention geckos.
Yep.
Who, very famously, don't have eyelids, and so, for the job of cleaning the eye, they went, what organ is available for this purpose? And it's tongues.
Tongue says, I volunteer.
And now my eye is clean.
Yep, so we could do this all day.
Yes, we could. But we shan't.
We won't. Because...
Get on the Discord. You share all sorts of fun stories of animal tongues.
Check out the blog post. I found a bunch of really great YouTube videos that go through how a bunch of these tongues work, but also that just give examples of a bunch of cool tongues. Check those out.
Yep. Take the spell tongues for your wizard character.
Yes, please do.
So engage.
It's really convenient.
Engage with tongues.
But for now, we will pause our discussion on just the variety of tongues so that we can take a break and then come back to talk about the evolution and fossil history of tongues, which is equally as fascinating and weird. As is often the case when we talk about the fossil record of a soft body part, the tongue's an unusual case because the tongue itself doesn't really fossilize.
No, it's so very soft tissue.
It's so soft. So we don't really have fossil tongues, but luckily the tongue is not alone. The hyoid is a bone and is intrinsically tied to the tongue.
Yes. I believe there are a few examples of actual tongues being fossilized. There are ice-preserved fossils, like
things like that
I think have been found with tongues. I think there have been amber tongues. And there's, we talked about this in episode 131, I think, the vulture head that was encased in a pyroclastic flow that preserved the shape of the tongue, along with like the eyeballs.
Yes, I forgot about that one.
Every now and then we'll get like a really good preservation of something with soft tissue evidence that also has the tongue along with it.
Yes.
But most times we're looking at tongues in the fossil record, it's the bony component.
Absolutely. Which can still tell us a bunch about the tongue.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking before about the different ways the hyoid is important. The structure of it varies for different types and functions of tongue.
Precisely. So we absolutely have ways when the hyoid preserves, it's still a smaller, more delicate part of the body.
Yeah, the hyoid is the kind of bone that you get excited if you find it at I think the other day I was talking to Laura about the newest rhino excavated at the Gray Fossil Site, and she mentioned the hyoid, and I went, "We got the hyoid?
Ooh, I didn't know that.
Cool."
That's
because
awesome.
you often don't get the hyoid.
Well, it's like the sclerotic ring, the eye rings.
Yeah, or the baculum.
Yeah. These are small, these are delicate. If the
So
body...
often they're floating.
Yes. If the body gets disturbed or was fed upon, it's more likely that these are going to be taken or removed or shift. So the hyoid's still relatively rare as far as a fossil goes, but we do have quite a number of fossilized hyoids that we're able to get an idea of tongues through time and tongues of certain groups. As far as the evolution of the tongue goes, it seems to be distinctly tied to when vertebrates came on land. This seems to be a terrestrial structure. We mentioned already that fish don't really have tongues, not the way we understand a tongue. They might have tongue type structures, but it's not doing the tongue thing. But some of the earliest tetrapods, those amphibian cousins, seem to already have movable muscular tongues. So this seems to be a tool for living on land, and most likely due to swallowing in air versus water, like we mentioned earlier.
Right. There's a whole list of features that show up in tetrapods that are part of the onto land transition. Just because your body functions differently on land than in water, the way that you feed and take in and manipulate food is a big part of that.
Absolutely. Many have pointed to that this is kind of mirrored in the metamorphosis of amphibians that start out without a tongue, and then as they metamorphose often into terrestrial life forms, they gain a muscular, mobile tongue. So this was likely important or potentially critical for the survival on land, where swallowing without a tongue structure would have been more difficult and maybe impossible, depending on what the exact structure of the throat was going on back then.
Or what you're eating.
Exactly.
It may have limited what food options were available.
One example that comes to mind is they did a study on mudskipper fish that hunt on land, but they use water in their mouth to bring the prey into the mouth.
Yes.
When they had put the prey on a diaper, an absorbent surface, and it absorbed the water, they couldn't swallow it.
Yep.
A dry mouth built for water can't swallow in air. You need a helping hand and
or a helping tongue.
A helping tongue.
No, you need an appendage.
An appendage to help with that job of moving it, and the musculature also to help swallow once you get the food in the right place. This is also paralleled by the keratinization probably taking place as amniotes started to move further from the water and into drier habitats.
Yep.
It's likely showed up with them early on. There are other tongue-like things in the fossil record. I found it mentioned that there are some jawless fish with structures that seem to be for a similar tongue-like job. Not the same structure, but there do seem to be tongue-like appendages potentially in some ancient jawless fish, but then are not present in the ancestral jawed fish to us tetrapods.
Right. So probably convergently evolved tongue feature.
Exactly. But there does seem like there were previous quote-unquote tongues that have been used. I didn't find a ton of information about what they might have been like as a tongue.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like tongues came around, went away, and then came back with our ancestors. The musculature and structure of the tongue came from ancestrally parts of the gill arches made up the hyoid. So the same things that eventually made up vertebrate jaws. Those are where part of the bones for the hyoid came from. The musculature seems to have come from gill muscles.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And we actually can watch this once again in the metamorphosis of tadpoles to frogs, that they have muscles, hyobrachial muscles, the hyobrachial apparatus, that are used to pump the gills, and then as they metamorphose, those shift into the muscles of the movable tongue.
Yeah.
So it used to be breathing muscles, in a way. And then over time, the tongue has diversified into the many, many forms that we've discussed, and many previous forms. Through studying the hyoid, we can actually learn a ton about potential feeding and anatomical structures of different groups. Simply reconstructing the face is one thing that can come up. I found a lot of research about that with dinosaurs, not too surprisingly. A lot of tongue research ends up being about dinosaurs because we want to know what their tongues were. We want to know what they were like.
Yep, and we've got a lot of good skeletons.
Yes, we do.
Sometimes with hyoid apparati.
One study I found was looking at to try to figure out what shape the fleshy tongue would be. And so they were looking at modern day relatives, birds and crocs. Crocs have a fairly simplified hyoid. It's not nearly as ornate as a lot of other groups. This makes sense because their tongue is also fairly mundane.
Yeah, sort of like a flap.
It's not even flappy, it's adhered to the bottom of their mouth.
Yeah.
They can't lift the tongue. They can't move it. They can relax the bottom of their mouth to make that pouch, but they can't move their tongue. It's basically no longer functioning for feeding or anything else. They eat large prey, so they don't need help manipulating small, delicate things.
Right. They also feed in the water.
They feed in the water
much of the time.
And when they're feeding on land, they toss it back like the toucan and like the gravitational feeding, where they are just throwing it back to the throat. This simplified form is pretty similar to a lot of ancestral archosaurs, so the group that leads to dinosaur birds and pterosaurs. So it's likely that a lot of them had a very croc-like tongue going on. This is not identical to the ancestral condition. They did specify it is derived for crocs.
Sure. And well, because crocs are doing something very particular with their feeding strategy.
But ancestral archosaurs also had a pretty simplified hyoid, so likely not doing a lot of fancy tricks with the tongue, mostly probably flat on the bottom of the mouth, or at least simplified like that.
Sure. So early dinosaurs and dinosaur relatives couldn't like tie up a cherry stem.
No,
or
exactly.
any of those fancy tricks.
And it sounds like most dinosaurs also mirror this, at least closer than not.
Okay.
So it's likely most dinosaurs couldn't stick out their tongue. Like they couldn't be moving it out of the mouth or moving it around the mouth a lot.
Sure.
You know, not all of them, but in general, dinosaur tongues don't seem, with this comparison to crocodilian hyoids, which have a fairly similar shape.
Right. So most likely they were relatively simple, not very mobile tongues. One of the Jurassic Park movies has someone get licked by a dinosaur tongue.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
It's the T-Rex.
The second one.
It's the T-Rex in the waterfall. Licks.
Yep, that's the one.
Yep. And so yeah, probably not a lot of that. You probably, if you have a pet dinosaur someday, it probably can't lick your face. So I apologize to everyone. Probably not going to happen.
In Jurassic World, one of the things that paleontologists got excited about was that the mosasaur was depicted with a forked tongue, similar to monitor lizards and snakes, which is probably accurate.
Yes.
Because just based on who they're related to.
So
that's pretty cool.
They also have openings that could definitely associate with a vomeronasal organ. So they might have a Jacobson's organ that's would function with that.
Yeah, so a mosasaur might have been able to lick your face.
Yep. I found research on that, and they said that it probably would look similar to like Helodermata, and like
Gila monsters,
beaded lizards, where it's forked-ish, but not as forked as a snake.
Yeah.
And the back is probably still functioning for like manipulating food and stuff. So a simplified forked tongue, a not quite as specialized forked tongue, which we see in lots of lizards, where the front is used for smelling, back is still used for other tongue functions like feeding and manipulating food. There are dinosaurs with modified tongues. One paper I found said that it's estimated that at least 3 different times there was notable modification of the tongue.
Okay.
Notably in the lineage that leads to birds.
I was going to say, birds have some modified weird hyoid structures.
So there are theropods that have modified tongues, usually later theropods groups, that end up seeming to have more specialized hyoids that suggest a more active and mobile tongue. So certain theropods definitely might have been able to give you puppy kisses.
Sure.
But in general, most dinosaurs couldn't. Some of the ones I found mentioned with unusual hyoids. Certain types of oviraptors have been found that seem to have mobile tongues, similar to, they noted, like herbivorous and omnivorous birds.
Okay.
So potentially kind of like a parrot's tongue.
Yeah, maybe useful for moving seeds into the right position for chomping on them or something.
Yep. So they have some features that suggest their tongue was more active in feeding. The bird lineage obviously has a very specialized hyoid. We've talked about some of them, but one of the things that they did that is unique to birds is their hyoid moved up into the tongue more notably and has a structure called the paraglossal, which effectively is the shape of the tongue.
Huh. So it's like a bony rod with it's sort of supporting the shape of the tongue.
It's kind of like a tongue baculum.
I was going to say, it sounds like the baculum, which supports the soft tissue.
And so they have this unique structure that gives them give us a very good idea of what their tongue looked like, first off, and a highly mobile tongue. It's associated with high mobility and being able to move the tongue a lot more. So probably using it for a lot of diverse feeding styles.
Interesting.
They weren't the only one noted to do this. Carnotaurus also has a similar structure, but convergent, their own version of a tongue bone.
Yeah.
So they also probably had a mobile, active tongue.
So that prehistoric planet Carnotaurus should also have been like wagging its tongue around. And it's part of its courtship display.
It's just like with the tongue hanging out like a panting dog. That's a lot of work. That dance took...
Well, like a cartoon dog, a cartoon wolf that has fallen in love. The tongue's going to come out.
the rollable tongue for mating displays. Similar tongue structures have also been noted in pterosaurs, and specifically for elongation of tongues. Both birds and pterosaurs show very similar features for elongated tongues.
Interesting.
So it's likely that pterosaurs might have been feeding like a lot of long-tongued birds, or at least doing similar things with their long beak and longer tongues.
Yeah, that's interesting to see that in 2 different flying groups.
Yeah.
That pterosaurs might have been picking up food with their tongues similar to the way that birds do it.
The specific study I found was comparing them with Enantiorniths, the Cretaceous
birds.
Yep. That they had a very similar structure in how they elongated their tongue and made it more mobile. There was also one Enantiornith called Brevirostreavis, which had a notably elongated tongue based on the hyoid. This was a specimen found in China, and they have a hyoid bone that is only slightly shorter than the skull, so very large compared to the skull, which is direct evidence for long-tongued feeding, very similar to we see in other birds today. So it probably had similar mobility, maybe not exactly the same lengths, but similar lengths and mobility as like hummingbirds and honey eaters and stuff like that. What's weird about it is it has a shorter beak. Almost all the other long-tongued birds have a proportionally long beak.
Yeah.
This bird's beak was short with a long tongue, which is a pairing up we've not seen in any other bird that we know.
Yeah.
So we're not sure what it was doing with that tongue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because the feeding mechanism is often the birds are sticking the long beak into whatever they're feeding.
Yep.
And then the tongue is an extension out of that.
Yes. So they're doing potentially something different.
Something totally... Tongue wrestling. Yeah. Just wrapping... Like snakes when they're fighting. The tongues just wrap around each other.
Tongue tying.
Like a tug of war. and they pull.
Gross.
Whoever
gross.
falls into the mud first is the loser, and the other one gets to go mate.
This is awesome. Speaking of long tongues, I found a whole paper about xenarthran hyoids, which are evidently unusual for mammal hyoids.
Well,
because
so xenarthrans, dear listeners, is the group of mammals that includes sloths, armadillos, glyptodons, and their group of cousins, which are just routinely so weird.
Everything, their backbones are weird, their skulls are weird, everything about them's weird.
Everything skeletally and beyond about the xenarthran group is just so bizarre.
Their hyoid is notable for a bunch of the elements. So typically, like I said, there's 10 elements, on average. Mm-hmm. The one they were using specifically when they described it was a cows and bovine.
Okay, so the familiar hyoid.
The familiar hyoid, if you open up most mammals, 10 parts with some cartilage, they fused a bunch of theirs down into a more reduced element-wise hyoid. Still can be complex in what it does, but fewer elements. It sounds like the amount of fusion is different depending on which xenarthran group you look at, so it's not consistent. But one of the critical things is the thyrohyoids and the basial hyoids, which is some of the side ones and the middle one, have fused into a V-shaped bone, which is characteristic of xenarthrans.
Okay.
So they have a very unique hyoid, but we have a number of hyoids from them that give us an idea of how much their tongue could have protruded, because a bunch of pictures of ground sloths show them with a long tongue like a giraffe pulling leaves into the mouth and stuff.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. This research actually went through and found how many of them probably could have been doing any of that. And it varies quite a bit across groups. For sloths, some of them, like Nothrotherids and Myolontids, had hyoids that seemed to suggest tongue protrusion could have been quite able.
Sure. So like a giraffe.
Yeah.
We didn't mention giraffes in detail earlier, but giraffes will stick out their long tongue and wrap it around a branch and just pull the leaves off that branch.
They have a prehensile tongue.
Yes.
Now, it never described how giraffe-like their tongues could be.
Sure, but maybe useful potentially for grabbing leaves or something.
They should be able to stick their tongues out of their mouth, and these seem to have been able to do a considerable amount of outreach with the tongue, so to speak.
Slurping eggs out of nests.
Just wet-willying their friend. But they were for different reasons. The first group had a slender hyoid, which suggested that, while the other one had one that had very mobile articulations, so lots of bending areas.
Interesting.
So different setups for the protruding tongue. Other groups, like Megatherium and some of its cousins, had very rigid hyoids, very rigid articulation, which seems to suggest they probably couldn't protrude their tongues much. And these are some of the ones often drawn with that reaching tongue.
Interesting.
They probably had a fairly limited tongue in how much they could be doing anything like that.
So maybe different diets.
Yes.
They might be eating food that it just isn't useful at all to have that mobile tongue.
Getting the food in a different way. Like maybe the others use their tongue to grab food more and they were using their hands to grab food more.
Yeah.
So it might be just different habits. This Cingulata, which is your armadillos and in here glyptodonts and stuff, also have some interesting tongues. One group, Prosatus, which resembles modern armadillos in many ways, had a hyoid that indicates tongue protrusion like a lot of armadillos today. So it seems like it probably was being very armadillo-like.
Yeah.
They slurp up insects and they eat food with the help of their tongue. While glyptodonts and some of their relatives had very fused hyoids, which suggested very little protrusion, and also supported a sister group relationship for a couple of the groups they found.
Oh, interesting.
That their hyoids seem to suggest, these are indeed as related as we thought they were.
That's cool.
Which is a fun side bit. But they did find that glyptodont tongues seem to be powerful. So they might be using the tongue in chewing for tough plants or using it to grind it against the roof of the mouth in a certain way.
Yeah.
So it's not doing anything fancy like a giraffe, but it might be still doing a lot of work during eating. There are also super weird tongues in the fossil record. One of the ones that I found that was most exciting was a group of amphibians. These are Albanerpetontid. This is a Jurassic group. They that showed up in the Jurassic and went all the way to the Pleistocene.
This is the fourth group of Lys amphibia.
Yeah.
The long-lost fourth group.
These are some very well-preserved specimens. I believe it was in amber. These are small amphibians.
Yeah, I think they're superficially salamander-like.
Yes, kind of salamandery. This one preserved all sorts of things, but it also preserved the hyoid and part of the tongue.
Ooh.
This was species Yaksha peredii, which was actually fully articulated, and the tongue showed that, from what they could tell, it had a ballistic tongue, like the salamander chameleon. They didn't specify which way it was ballistic. I didn't find a description of if it's launching the hyoid or off the hyoid.
Sure.
But they compared it most to chameleons, so I assume off the hyoid.
Mm-hmm.
But that it seems to have a ballistic tongue, and there was some evidence on the feet that it might be a climber.
Like chameleons.
So these might have been chameleon-like amphibians.
Cool.
Yeah. The hyoid, the tip is still attached to the tip of the tongue pad.
Mm-hmm.
So they can see that, yeah, it seems to be a prey capture tongue.
That's very cool.
I didn't see any descriptions of like how far it might have gone out of the body or how long the tongue might have been. So it might have been a more modest prey capture.
Sure.
Probably not as extreme as modern chameleons.
Right. Just because modern chameleons are dramatic.
The most extreme of any animal for tongue to body.
Yes.
like they're ridiculous. But yeah, it seems like another group did the ballistic tongue thing, potentially in even a similar lifestyle way as chameleons.
Very cool.
Right? Once again, there are other cool examples. We can't go through every single one, but one thing I did want to spend some time talking about was our hyoid and our tongue and the evolution of the human hyoid in relation to speech, because that is something very unique to us. It's very unique about our tongue and our hyoid, and there's a lot of interesting things that seem to have happened in human evolution to cause it to be the way it is.
Yeah. And this is a nice add-on to our conversation from last episode,
Yep.
191, about language.
Absolutely. So as some reminders, our hyoid has become separated from the tongue. It's also moved down our throat quite a bit.
Yes. It's in the middle, like you said.
Yeah. In most animals, it's further up toward the tongue.
Right. Like, often it sounds like in the mouth.
Yeah.
With the tongue.
Or right behind, like with the chameleon, you can actually watch, there's a video that I found where you can watch the hyoid is right behind the mouth and then moves into the mouth when they're ready to launch. So it's like right under the jaw.
Yeah.
Is kind of the normal place for a lot of other animals. Ours is halfway down our throat. Very low for a hyoid. It is thought that this probably is the result, or at least happened in parallel with the downward and backward movement of our face as we became bipedal. Mm-hmm. And our face started to have to look forward in the same direction as our chest instead of in the same line as our spine.
Right. And the spine shifted to meet the skull from underneath. So our neck is underneath our head instead of behind it.
And now our face is under our brain case instead of in front of it,
Yep.
like most animals. Ours now is in this unique position, which moved the tongue back as we did, and moved the hyoid down the throat, it seems. Our face also became shorter over time, moving the tongue further into the throat. Our larynx also moved down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are not the only species where the larynx moving down the throat is noted, but it was, the one I found that mentioned that did say that it doesn't seem to affect the vocalizations of others where it's moved. Ours does seem to have affected that, so ours has done it in a unique way, or at least we're using it differently in its new, further down the throat position. As we stood up and our face shifted, it moved the tongue and hyoid back and down the throat. Our hyoid moved even further from the tongue down into the throat separate now. Why this happened, though, is part of the question of why did things start to happen differently? It's not just that our face moved, but also our hyoid and tongue got disassociated from each other. It's thought that one of the main reasons might be that our tongue isn't as important for manipulating food as it is in a lot of other animals. That there's been a disconnect between one of the jobs our tongue typically has, or a tongue often has in many other animals, and us in other primates. When we look at other primate and cousin hyoids and tongues, we can see that like lemurs have markedly different hyoid structures than we see in monkeys and apes. Their tongue is also used, it has more freedom of movement and used more heavily in getting their food. And so it has a more typical, so to speak, mammal shape and job. While when we look at monkeys and apes, we see that there's less dedication to the tongue being able to move and do as much food manipulation. Probably because they're now using their hands.
Yes, we have hands to help. We don't need a ballistic tongue or anything like that.
Or I don't need to use my tongue to like unwrap the fruit or get to the stuff inside. I have hands that can do that job.
I can take it apart. I can hold it while I bite into it.
Yes, exactly.
I've got. Well, you said before that when feeding in air on land, it's nice to have a helping hand.
Yes,
primates literally have 2 helping hands to do that.
Absolutely. So it's very likely that as we started to be able to manipulate foods with a new body part, that took some of the pressure off the tongue.
Okay, makes sense.
Now it could become de-specialized a little bit for that.
Right.
And just start to evolve a little bit differently. And there's less pressure on it to be a specific shape. As this trend continues into the hominid lineage, we see even further less specialization and selection for the tongue to be mobile for food manipulation. As the trend of us manipulating food in other ways continues, like we now have tools that I can carve meat or, cut up plants with. I can cook it. So it's now easier to chew and eat. And so we just kept taking more of the job of manipulating food into other ways that we behave and other tools and behaviors.
And I think this whole trend and pattern goes along with the general smaller shape of the jaw. We have smaller teeth than a lot of other primates. Our jaws are also not as powerful as in other primates.
Yes, indeed.
And this has often been suggested as a deprioritization of the powerful, capable mouth for food because we have tools and techniques that help us deal with food.
Yeah, like if you watch an orangutan or a chimpanzee eat, they use their hands, but their mouth is still this powerful can opener of a mouth.
Right.
That can like peel a papaya or like open up food to get to it with their lips and stuff. They have very mobile lips, very strong jaws.
Whereas we don't really... I mean, you can use your mouth to open up stuff and bite chunks off of stuff. But that's not really what we're typically doing.
We're not as good as them at it.
We're just not that good at it.
But now I've got a hammer or a knife or a can opener.
Or a fire.
Yes, and I can get to it in a new way. And this not only seems to deprioritize the tongue for that, but also our jaw muscles, as you mentioned, which freed up musculature in the face for new facial movements and new tongue movements. So our tongues now had access and our mouths had access to new musculature to do new things. So this deprioritizing of food manipulation might have made way for us to start to manipulate words.
Right. It's a relaxing of pressures.
Yeah.
And pressures in the terms of selective pressure. If the muscles of the mouth and the tongue and all that don't have to be that way in order for us to eat effectively, there's room for experimentation in natural selection for them to take on different shapes and different functions.
Precisely.
And if they became important for communication, right, facial expression, mouth noises, all that sort of, once it starts to become useful for communication, now that's a new selective pressure that can take over.
Absolutely. So now it can start being highly selected for that. So a mixture of upright gait and our dexterous hands likely took away some of the jobs from the tongue and the mouth for how we handle food and then freed it up for the job of talking, which is now where the other aspects of studying human speech evolution come in, is looking at different human relatives, ancestors, and different species of human at the hyoid and jaw structure to try to figure out how much and how would your speech have been.
Right. Can they vocalize and communicate verbally the same ways that we can?
Yes.
And how close are you?
And so trying to connect the aspects of human vocalization with the anatomy of our face and throat has been a big look at to try to figure out how many sounds, how many vowel sounds could this species make? How many, enunciation, how many different kinds of consonants could they have achieved compared to what we can achieve?
Yeah, this is something... because our manner of speech and language and communication is in large part a function of anatomy. It's not just that we are smart enough to speak. We were talking about this the other day. We were watching Planet of the Apes.
Yep.
And in the Planet of the Apes movies, the apes get smart and then they start speaking human language. And that's not how that would work.
No.
Chimpanzees don't have the physical anatomy to make the same kinds of noises that we do.
Well, it's very similar while we were watching this as well. Maurice the orangutan was making a bunch of his orangutan noises.
Yeah.
And we were talking about how I wish I could make that noise, but I don't have a resonance pouch on my throat.
Yes.
So I can't make an orangutan noise the same way or accurate to the noise they're making.
And an orangutan can't speak words the same way that we could. Well, our words can't make the same human noises that we make.
Yep. And so, and like even things that do mimic human speech, they're doing it in a different way. They're using different, like birds are using a different structure. They're not using lips or teeth because they don't have those.
Yep.
So they are using a completely different system to make that sound.
And it's why when you listen to parrots talk, you can hear it's an imperfect mimicry.
Yes.
Not only because it's mimicry, but also because they don't have the parts. There are certain parts of like certain consonants that they can't say because they don't have that. Like they can't say the F sound.
Yeah.
They can't make that noise with their mouth. They have to approximate it. Kind of the way that ventriloquists.
Yeah.
If you listen to ventriloquists, there's a bunch of noises, specific language bits that they're not doing.
Yep.
Because they can't, with their mouth closed, make certain the sounds of certain letters.
Yes, that require you to move your mouth.
Right. You can't say P. You can't say pot with your lips closed, so they have to approximate that.
Yep. Or choose words that don't use that sound.
Yes.
So they just edit around it. There's been tons of studies to try to figure out how much other humans could have talked, so to speak. And it's been very contentious.
Sure.
Lots of responses and disagreements onto how accurate that those analyses are. So we won't be able to go through and say how each of them talked, because that is not an agreed upon, settled aspect of the human fossil record. But there are some ways that people have looked at to try to figure out how similar to human speech or similar to other apes the vocalizations might have been. Hyoid is one of them. Ours does differ from other ape hyoids. Ours is fairly bar-shaped, while I found theirs described as bullow-shaped. So it does have a different overall structure. So we do find hyoids that are kind of between those shapes, which might suggest that there's a transitional vocalization, that maybe they were enunciating somewhat like us, but still a lot like a chimpanzee. Homo heidelbergensis was one of the ones noted to have a transitional hyoid, so that it may have been somewhat between the vocalizations of ape and man. So, this is what extent that means vocalizations is hard to tie down, because like the sounds a gorilla and a chimpanzee make are still very different. Yes. Even though they have more similar hyoids. But broad scope-wise.
Closer to what we see in modern humans.
So we might be able to have an idea of kind of where in a range some of them might have been with that. A lot of studies looked at the base of the skull and how much it was flexed as our skull, became more and more the human skull and bended forward, so to speak. The flexation of the base of our skull shifted, and there was a number of studies, like previous and historical studies, that looked at that as being a huge proponent of the shape of the mouth and therefore what sounds it could make. And so trying to find where on the graph of how flexed the base of the skull is was used by many of them to try to make assertions for how human-like the vocalizations might be. This led to things like suggesting that Neanderthals probably didn't have the same airways as us and wouldn't have had fully human vocalization, not fully to the extent we have. The studies looking at the Neanderthal skull this way also mention that due to the restructuring of our skull and how low the larynx is made, those have not fully taken place in a Neanderthal skull. It's not at the same position as our skull. So for them, based on their understanding, to be able to make the same sounds as us, their larynx would have to be so low that it's unreasonable. That it's to a point that's not seen in any other primate. So that it just doesn't seem like they'd be able to make the same vocal tract, achieve the same vocal tract as we can. But others have critiqued these and said that the skull base is not accurate because it does not tell you enough about the shape of the soft tissue. Sure. So many have, going from that angle, have said that they can't see a reason Neanderthals couldn't achieve the same vocalizations we can. So it's gone back and forth. There's been different ways to look at it. Not everyone's agreed on the different interpretations. But looking at these skeletal structures could potentially give us an idea of what sounds could be possible or outside the range of some of our ancestors and cousins.
Yeah. It's very cool and very difficult to pin down because there's already so much variation in the vocal repertoire of just humans.
Yes, exactly.
Like just within our own species, the shape of the mouth and the position of the tongue and the larynx and all that varies a whole bunch, which is why there's such a variety of different voices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Among humans, which raises interesting questions about what the voices of our extinct cousins might have sounded like, or what type of sounds they might have either been capable of making, or what sort of sounds would have been the common sounds for them to use.
Yeah.
Like there are certain sounds in humans that show up in almost every language or in every language, and then there are some sounds that are weirder or rarer. It's not weirder, but rarer sounds. I'm thinking of the R, rarer.
Yeah.
That R is an unusual sound among human languages. English is an unusual language for having that R.
Yes, that it is very difficult for many other language speakers to achieve that R sound, because they did not grow up with it.
Yes, which is why so often you'll hear people who speak other languages natively struggle with R or our TH sound.
Yes.
That's an unusual sound among languages, which is why you hear French speakers sort of stereotypically will replace it with a Z or something.
Yes.
That's because that sound isn't in a lot of other languages. That is a very tongue-dependent sound. Both of those, the R and the the theta. In IPA, I think it's well, one of them is because there's and there's and those are two different sounds because one of them is voiced. But these are sounds that we are using our tongues in ways that other cultures are not using them.
Yeah.
So there's tons of variety even just within our species today. Let alone who knows what Neanderthals and Homo erectus and stuff might have been doing.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking of, is like there's sounds that my mouth should be able to make that I don't know how to make. Like I don't know how to do the clicks that are in certain languages. I can't achieve those correctly because I never learned how.
Yeah.
But if I had never been introduced to that language, I wouldn't know my mouth could do that.
Yes.
I wouldn't know that my voice should be able to achieve that.
When you're a kid and you're just messing around with sounds and you discover a new noise you can make. I say when you're a kid, I still do this.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, there's all sorts of versatility.
Yeah, you just mess around with voices and something you do and you go, whoa, I've never made a noise from that part of my mouth.
Gonna make that sound for the next week.
Yep.
Non-stop.
So like, it's at like behavior, it's very hard to tell what is possible versus was done. And same here. Maybe they could make that noise. Did they?
Yeah.
Maybe they couldn't make that noise, but did they make something equivalent to it so that, you still could have a conversation with them. They just can't quite do the O, but they can do and that's going to get you to all the same words. So it can be a very murky thing to try to overinterpret it because it's so messy. And with that, we can wrap up our discussion on tongues. This was a ton of fun. It's tongue twisters. We didn't even talk about those. It was so much fun to find all of these cool examples. We could not possibly find them all. Once again, please go to the Discord. Tell us what your favorite example is. Message us or share what your coolest, what you think the neatest tongue trick out there in nature is. But for now, we will pause our discussion. We will end our discussion and move on to our final section of the episode, which is our patron question. Every episode, we like to pull one of the questions our patrons ask us, because if you sign up at certain levels, you can submit questions that we'll answer here on the podcast. And the question for this episode is
from Ryan, who asks about pterosaur flight. Pterosaurs, of course, we mentioned earlier, the Mesozoic flying reptiles. Ryan asks, what lines of evidence make us confident that pterosaurs could fly and not just glide? What makes us think they actually flew?
Yes, like we can observe their anatomy, but we haven't actually gotten to see them fly. How do we know they were almost certainly flying animals? This is a very good question, and it's that all-important thing of we can't observe the fossils do what it was likely they were doing. The first, obvious answer is this: they're shaped like flyers.
Yes.
They have the anatomy of a flying animal. Their arms are obviously wings, so at least some sort of airfoil for gliding or flying.
Mm-hmm.
But then their skeleton also has other features. They have a strong sternum for attaching flight muscles, different than the keeled one of a bird, but still with tons of flight muscle attachment. So their arms are stronger than we would expect a gliding arm to be.
Right. They also have in the arm bones themselves, they are reinforced structures for withstanding stresses.
Absolutely.
Like we see in flying animals today.
Yep. So the interior structure of the bones looks like a flyer.
We also have, as we discussed in the gliders episode, in 148, the shape of gliding is not the same as the shape of flying.
Yeah, the shapes that seem to be idealized for a glider don't actually overlap heavily with the shapes we see in flying animals.
Yeah, and flyers, pterosaurs don't just look superficially like the overall shape of a flying animal. They have detailed, specific anatomical features these are wings that can flap and can withstand the stress of flapping, both in the arm structure, but also the tissue, the membrane of the wing has that powerful structure. They've got a patagia between the legs.
So their anatomy suggests flying in basically all its regards. There's also been tons of studies on the aerodynamics of their shape, where people have put models into air tunnels, but also computer models into simulations, and found that physics-wise, it sure does seem like they should be able to power themselves through the air.
Yes.
Like, all the math checks out that this shape of animal, with the musculature their bones suggest, should absolutely be able to achieve powered flight.
Yes. And we've talked about before that they not only seem to have the appropriate anatomy and musculature and such for powered flight, but also for takeoff.
Yes, exactly.
For the things that are part of flying. They also often have very similar evidence of very similar lifestyles or feeding behaviors and such as a lot of modern flying animals.
Absolutely. So what often happens with many fossilized behaviors, they are seemingly so specialized for flight that it would be more bizarre if they didn't fly.
Yeah, there's not really many other good ways to explain the shape of a pterosaur if they weren't flighted.
Yes.
They are built for flight in every aspect.
Exactly. There would have to be some thing we've never encountered or considered that they were doing that's utterly unique and bizarre. Mm-hmm. So most likely Occam's razor says they were flying.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All the evidence points that way.
In some ways, they seem to have been better flyers than our modern flyers.
Yeah.
Like they're even more specialized in certain regards for flight.
Yes.
The question of whether or not pterosaurs were true flyers or gliders has a long history in paleontology.
Absolutely.
The sort of back and forth. And each time we dig into certain features of the anatomy, we find the sometimes surprising result that they were adept flyers. We see the shape of the wings varies in the same ways we see with modern birds.
Yep.
That are closed environment flyers versus big soarers. And even the biggest pterosaurs, which is often when this question comes up, is we look at Quetzalcoatlus and we go, that thing has a 40-foot wingspan and weighed as much as 2 grown human adults.
How in the world could that get in the air?
Could that actually fly? Were they flightless pterosaurs? Were they just gliders? And all the evidence we have about their anatomy and their biomechanics suggests that though they are gigantic and there isn't anything like that today, they are specialized for flight.
Yes.
The way we would expect them to be specialized for flight.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, pterosaurs. There are other animals, like there are a bunch of dinosaurs that we've looked at and gone, how much flying was this doing? Was it more of a glider? This has come up with Microraptor and with and even with Archaeopteryx. But pterosaurs are pretty squarely in the flyers box.
Yeah. Like there's a bunch of them that we can tell, like a bunch of the dinosaurs that we can tell were flappers. Mm-hmm. But how much were you flying? And so that question is hard to answer with some groups.
Yes.
But pterosaurs seem pretty solidly to be really good in the air.
Yes.
Good question, though, because that is
Great
a question
question.
we have to acknowledge.
Episode 79 for the full download on all the pterosaur good stuff.
Yeah.
Also, episode 6, all the way back for the
right.
evolution of flight.
Whenever you mention a single digit one,
Yep, we
it
did
freaks me out a little bit.
Episode 6. This episode, we talked a bunch about primates. Episode 7.
Blah.
That was way back at the start.
I'm so old. So old. I'm almost 200 episodes old. This was a very fun episode.
Yeah.
I hope you all enjoyed. I had more fun with this than I have for many others, just because it was so many cool examples. Check out the blog for a bunch of the links and sources and other, like videos that we couldn't share here with you all. Comment and engage on the Discord or in the comments section of our social media or the blog, wherever you'd like, and let us know what you thought or what your thoughts are on tongues. Remember, we got Croc and Snake Month coming up.
Yes, June is Croc Month. We will have the channel on the Discord. We'll have special content going on. We've got live streams coming up for that. And we will have our special Patreon tier where subscriptions to us will contribute to donations to conservation efforts to protect our favorite reptiles. And as we mentioned at the top of the episode, donations are being matched this year thanks to generous additional donations. So join in on all the Croc and Snake Month fun.
It's a very exciting Croc and Snake Month this year. Thank you to all of our requesters for prompting us to discuss this awesome topic. Also, welcome and thank you to all our new patrons. And extra special thank you to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Daniel the Bug Lover, Robert Mart, and Melissa Barksdale. We release episodes every fortnight.
That's right.
And now I'm going to let my tongue rest.
Yeah, there's a lot of tongue flapping
Yeah.
in this episode.
Like, I've been accused of that quite often, but this was a lot of it.
We really put them to work.
Bye till then.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.